just to make sure, if it is your first time attending this workshop is going to be like, you know, it's going to have two different sections. This is usually the way that it goes, that I usually have some notes. I take some notes and I present my notes, and we could discuss the topics that I have covered in those notes. You could find those topics, those notes on github.com JS Mentor React Workshops. For every single session, we have a different directory for notes, and we have a folder called apps. During this series of workshops, whenever I need to set up an application, I'm going to add that application here into this folder. And also you could read this previous session's notes, but for today we are going to cover middlewares and React Redux life cycle. The life cycle of Redux and the way that Redux middlewares work is the main focus of this session. So let's start. Okay. Middlewares, as we all know, are functions that are automatically called by the framework. So in this case, we are talking about Redux middlewares. But when we set up a middleware, for instance, if it is express.js middleware, it means that you have to create a function, and it is express.js which is going to call your function. We are going to cover that with more details. I'm asking you, if the other part of this note is just asking for you all to offer any specific React related topic. If you want to, I could add that to for the next session. We already have universal JavaScript using React and Next.js, but after that I have my own list. But if you are interested in covering other topics, I would be totally open, and I could consider your topics. These two links that you see here, redux-middleware, which is the official document of Redux about middleware, and the other one, Node.js design patterns middleware, is the document, post, and tutorial that I have used to prepare this workshop. You could, especially the official middleware document that you see here in redux.js.org, is really it is highly recommended for you to take a look into it. So what I'm going to do is just to start from the basics. What is a middleware? One of the most distinctive patterns in Node.js is definitely middleware. Unfortunately, it is also one of the most confusing ones, especially for newcomers, for inexperienced developers, and also especially for those who are coming from enterprise programming world, because enterprise world already has a term called middleware. Middleware in enterprise architecture represents the various software suites that help the abstract lower level mechanisms such as OS APIs, network communications, memory management, and so on, allowing the developer to focus only on the business case of the application, which means there are different types of patterns similar to what a middleware does, but in terms of middleware in enterprise architecture, what it does, it actually allows developer, just as I just said, to focus, to implement the business logic, and not to worry about OS APIs and other concerns in the application. But middleware, in its more generic meaning, can also define any kind of software layer that acts like a glue between lower level services and the application. We have, the application is the part that as a developer, we are in charge of, coding inside the application. But lower level services are not usually accessible when we write the code, are not usually accessible that easy, or they have specific protocols. And one of those, one of the practices that framework use to allow us developers to communicate with lower level services is using a middleware. If you want to, you could look it up and learn more about the enterprise related meanings of middleware. But here in this session, what we are going to do is to talk about middleware and middleware in express.js, and at the end, middleware in Redux, and the way that it helps us set up React applications. So Express popularizes the term middleware in the Node.js world, binding it to a very specific design pattern. In Express, in fact, a middleware represents, this is a really interesting definition, a set of services, typically functions, that are organized in a pipeline and are responsible for processing incoming HTTP requests and relative responses. So the point here is we could, Express.js already allows us to set up Node.js application, Node.js routes. Let me just show you. If you want to, you could take a look at the apps folder. Here, user management app, we already have an APIs folder here. Express.js already allows us to set up, this is how we could do that. Set up Express.js routes, allowing us to, for instance, scaffold out as RESTful API for a CRUD system, for instance, for a specific entity. In this case, in this application, the entities that I have are user and groups. So my point here is we already have this part inside the application. But the point here is a middleware is something that could be helpful if we need to, for instance, do a specific run a specific part of our code for all of our API calls, for instance. Before calling the API call, or after that, we need to do something. Instead of adding that piece of code to every single use case, for instance, if you want to log something, if you want to log all of your API calls, what you could do, you could force the developer inside the application to always call the, for instance, logger.log something, and then what you should do, you should implement a logger system and use it right here, before and after, inside your logic. For instance, in your when you have a try catch, in the catch you could log the error, and before running the API, going into the API, you could just log that this is a point that this right before calling the API, and even after that, if you want to, you could do that as well. But what a middleware does is it allows us to get rid of all of these concerns with doing it in just one single part of the application. An Express middleware has the following signature: request, response, next. Request is the coming request, and response is the response that we are gonna send back, and the next is actually the interesting part of it. Next is some sort of callback function that we have to call inside when we want to implement a middleware. We have to call that next to pass to actually pass the whole data or whatever we want to the next middleware. We have a pipeline with a lot of middlewares, and every single middleware should call next somewhere in its process. Why it is needed? Because as we all know, Node.js, JavaScript, express.js, here is the world of asynchronous operations. It's not that simple just to call the function and then call the next function. It's not just, we can't just, call a function and wait for that to be executed because of asynchronous operation, because it might take some time for that function to be actually executed. That's why we have this next. Yes, what we should do, we have to do, if it is an operation, if it is an asynchronous operation, what we could do, we could send the API call or do whatever asynchronous operation we want to do, and then in its callback, or when the data is ready, or we could call next. So you could just read my notes with more details. But if we think about it, these are all different tasks that are not strictly related to the main functionality of an application. As I just said about logging, here the main logic of the application in this case, in this function, is just to find a specific user in database based on its ID. It doesn't have anything to do with logging or reporting, crash reporting, or do something else. It is the logic that we need to do something like getting the list of data from database or finding a specific user by ID. So this is the logic. And whenever we need a middleware, we usually need a middleware when that task is not related to the main functionality of an application. And the other if is if that task is going to be called, is going to be used extensively throughout the whole application in all of our API calls, for instance. And rather, they are accessories, components providing support to the rest of the application and allowing the actual request handler to focus on their main business logic, as I just said. You could just think of this type of task that we need middleware for as software in the middle. Okay. Next step. Middleware as a pattern. So, I really like this part because I believe this is where we could, eventually wrap our head around this concept, a middleware. The technique used to implement a middleware in Express is not new. In fact, it can be considered the Node.js incarnation of the intercepting filter pattern. We already have a design pattern called intercepting filter pattern, and we are going to cover that in a second. And the other design pattern similar to a middleware is chain of responsibility pattern. So a middleware could be considered a combination of intercepting filter pattern and chain of responsibility pattern. In more generic terms, it also represents a processing pipeline, which reminds us about streams. It's really similar to the way that streams works. Today in Node.js, the word middleware is used well beyond the boundaries of the Express framework, and in the case of particular pattern. A set of processing units, filters, and handlers under the forms of functions. The point here is everything revolves around functions. And the other thing is that it is mostly focused, whenever we need a asynchronous operation, whenever we have an asynchronous sequence of actions. For us to be able to have a pre-processing and post-processing, we need that middleware. The main advantage of this pattern is flexibility. In fact, this pattern allows us to obtain a plugin infrastructure. So just take a look at this. We have so far intercepting filter design pattern, chain of responsibility pattern, processing pipeline with pre-processing and post-processing of actions in an asynchronous sequence. And now we have a plugin infrastructure. So, and all of these different concepts are sort of related to a middleware. Okay. So, a plugin infrastructure with incredibly little effort, providing an obtrusive way for extending a system with new filters and handlers. So the point here is we don't have to change the actual code. The other design pattern that I could add here is aspect-oriented programming. Aspect-oriented programming is exactly about the same thing. That we don't have to change the code, but we could add a functionality to, for instance, all of different API calls or every single part of the application which deals with database or to do similar things. Developer doesn't need to be worried about, logging database operations. Developer doesn't need to be worried about crash reporting. Developer is here just to implement the logic. Aspect-oriented programming, the first time that I used it was using Aspect-J. I haven't included aspect-oriented programming in my notes, but I had to. Yes, aspect-oriented programming is actually a design pattern, and it is really similar to the type of practices that we implement using a middleware. So yeah, you could look it up yourself, but if you want to, the name is Aspect-J in J2E. With Java, you could use it. Aspect-J, not JS. It is just, I have gotten used to, whenever there is a J, there has to be a JS. There has to be a S after that. Anyway, so this is Aspect-J about, we were here. Aspect-J was a framework in Java platform allowing us to do a similar thing, to sort of create middlewares. Okay, now what I'm going to do is cover one of those design patterns called intercepting filter pattern. Intercepting filter pattern again is a J2E pattern which creates pluggable filters. Just think about it, pluggable filters. Again, developer doesn't need to do anything. All developer does is just to create the logic, but after that, either the same developer or someone else could plug a new filter or unplug another filter to process common services in a standard manner without requiring changes to core request processing code. So the filters intercept incoming requests. It is really similar to what I just said about express.js filter, express.js middlewares. So in Express, we are talking about HTTP requests and HTTP responses. But here in intercepting filter pattern in J2E, we are talking about incoming requests again and outgoing responses. It doesn't matter if it is HTTP or not, but the point is filters intercept incoming requests and outgoing responses, allowing pre-processing again and post-processing. This is really, really important. If we look at this, we are going to talk about all of these different topics when we go for the next section of the workshop, which is just live coding. So we have pre-processing, post-processing, and these filters can be added or removed unobtrusively. The point here is without changing existing code, unobtrusively, without anyone noticing, new filters are added or removed based on different conditions. For instance, one of the useful use cases of this pattern is to have two different environments, to set up two different environments for our code base. To have, for instance, a development environment with a lot of different types of logging and different types of reporting middlewares, allowing us to debug the application much easier, versus the production environment, which doesn't have all of those, all it has is just the necessary middlewares. So this is why one of the use cases that I believe intercepting filter pattern could really help. It doesn't necessarily mean that this pattern is about HTTP request. And again, it is something that could be implemented with different types of actions. Whenever we have an asynchronous sequence of action, we could think of middlewares. This pattern applies reusable processing transparently before and after the actual request. This transparency is really important because, again, the developer doesn't know and shouldn't know anything about this, different middlewares that we inject or we plug or unplug from the application. And transparently before and after the actual request execution by the front end page controllers. This front end page controllers, these terms are J2E related terms. But if you want to learn more about intercepting filter pattern, what you could do is just to go to the Wikipedia post. I have just copied and pasted part of this document. You could learn more about it right here. Okay, this was the first design pattern, which is similar to a middleware. The second one, which I mentioned before, is chain of responsibility pattern. Yeah, okay. The point is, we are not gonna, talk about these patterns a lot, but I believe these are a really, these different patterns open a new angle, in front of our eyes to look at a middleware. In object-oriented design, the chain of responsibility pattern is a design pattern consisting of a source of command objects and a series of processing objects. Each processing object contains logic that defines the types of command. Each logic that defines the types of command objects that it can handle. One more time. Each processing object contains logic that defines the types of command object that it can handle. It's sort of similar to subscribing to a list and waiting for this specific type of command. The rest are passed to the next processing object in the chain. So if you look at this definition, we are going to read it again to make sure we understand this. If you look at this, we are talking about, again, a pipeline, a chain of actions. Here, a chain of commands. A source, one more time. In object-oriented design, the chain of responsibility pattern is a design pattern consisting of a source of command objects and a series of processing objects. Each processing object contains logic. That's the logic that defines the types of command objects that it can handle. So the relationship that these two have is when you have command objects and on the other side, the processing object, and the relationship is right here. Logic that defines the types of commands object that it can handle. The rest are passed to the next processing object. It is exactly the same as when we have a chain or a pipeline of middlewares, and after doing whatever we want to do inside our function, which is similar to command. Now, instead of a command, what we have in express.js is a middleware function. And what it does to pass again to the next processing object is to call the next function, next callback function. And also the point, another similar point is a mechanism also exists for adding new processing object to the end of this chain. Again, plugin infrastructure. A mechanism also exists for adding new processing object to the end of this chain. I believe if we just consider these different patterns, so we have two patterns in my nodes, one pattern not in my nodes, which was aspect-oriented programming, which I believe if we consider these three different patterns, it could be much easier to deal with middleware and to learn how a middleware works. Again, the link, the Wikipedia link is right here in the middle, in the bottom of the note. If you want to, you could click on that and learn more about it right here. It has actual code as an example. Let's get back. Okay, redux-middlewares. So far, what we have covered is different design patterns about different design patterns similar to middlewares, or sometimes I consider a middleware or a middleware pattern a combination of these different design patterns. Before we dig into Redux middlewares, what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you a real-world application that we already have in apps folder, and the way that we could set up express.js middlewares. So far we have already talked about express.js middlewares. And this is the signature, but I'm going to show you how they actually work. Right here, whenever you have an express.js application, you usually have a server.js, index.js, or whatever you want to name it, as the main, file which actually runs the HTTP server. And in this case, you could find the server.js inside this RC folder right here. This is the server.js file. So the way that Express works is it gives us a function called Express. We could call that. It returns an object, an application object. And you could name it differently. Sometimes people, instead of app, people name this variable as something like a server, which is the same exact thing for me. But the behavior matters here, that the first thing that we usually do, right here, this part doesn't matter. This is where you could register Node.js middlewares. What I have done here for you, I have registered, custom middlewares to show you how express.js middleware works. Here, this is the signature that we talked about. Request, response, next. So here, middleware for a coming request. In this case, we are talking about a HTTP request. A HTTP request comes through the application, comes through this HTTP server. Express detects the request, and what it does before calling our function, it has this pipeline of functions, or it has its pipeline of middleware functions, and it first goes through this list one by one. And what we should do here, we have to, this order that you see, we have, for instance, the first one here, the second one here, the third one here. This order matters because it is exactly the same order that express.js considers when a new request comes through the server. So I haven't done anything inside this middleware other than just logging something, and the only thing that I had to do was this part. I had to call next. What I could do also here, I could, for instance, pause the application. It's not something that we usually do in a real-world application, but just to show you that it fit, and to show that it is possible, we could do that. We could set up a set timeout, call it, let's say, 2 seconds. We could pause the processing, the process of the process of a request right here before it goes into the next pipeline, and then inside the set timeout we could call this next. Just before we do that, I want to make sure that you guys all can hear me. Okay, guys, can you hear me all? Great. So, do you have any specific questions so far? Great. So, if you had questions, just ping me even in the middle of the discussion. Great. So, what you see here, it is just, again, it is a middleware application. It is a simple express.js middleware. If I do this, it's not something that it's a really bad thing to happen to an application. It pauses every single request for 2 seconds. So let's just, before I do this, let me just run this without the pause. So just let us read the code. First one here is just to console log something, and then we have this middleware. Express itself has a middleware called static, which allows us to bind a specific directory in the server to a specific path, and which means now, for instance, in my case, I have a public folder, and whatever I put here, my logo, my assets, CSS, fonts, or whatever I want to, I could put it right here. And after my application is up and running, I could have access to all of these through a simple HTTP request as a public exposed file. So this is, again, is possible using a middleware. So if you take a look at this, what we have as a signature of a middleware, it is a function. But it is not actually, it doesn't seem to be a function for this static, because it is expressed as a static, but it is the execution of that function. So let me put it this way. Let's static middleware equals this. And this is actually the value that is being passed to the app.use. This, by the way, app.use is a way that you could register a new HTTP middleware. Okay, I thought we have a question. Nope. Okay, great. The point is, this static function also returns another function. Okay, to make sure what we could do, we could just put a console log here, and I'm gonna just run this application right now. So copy and type of this equals type of this. Let's see now. We will see that in a second. Okay, now the next one that I have registered, and another custom middleware, is just again before I call another middleware, I register another middleware called cookie parser. What I'm going to do is just output this request.cookies at this step, because request, even though request has cookies because of this middleware, because cookie parser is not registered, has not been registered yet. At this point, request doesn't have this request.cookies, and the value of this should be undefined. But after this, if I register a middleware, my requests would have request.cookies. And again here for body, we have body parser, and before I do that, but request.body should be undefined, but after that, request.body should have a value. Just let's run this application. Okay, user management app. Okay, npm start. So if you remember, this console log in line number 48 is going to be logged in the console right when when we run the application. So this is where we have to wait for that console log to appear. Okay, great, that's it. I just saw this out. We have a lot of different. For that, I just requested cookies, access, type of right here. Type of a static middleware is a function, which means all of this different, for instance, cookie parser middleware. When you call this cookie parser middleware function, it again returns another function that you could call or you could pass, but the signature of that function should be like this. It should be able to receive request, response, and next. So now what I'm going to show you is a post request. Okay, because post request has a body. Oh, let's go to the group section. For users. So before I do that, to clean everything, I stop the application and try it again to have. Okay, that's it. So we already have a bunch of different outputs right here, but okay, this is the last one. Now what I'm going to do is click on the save. As you see it, now it appeared right here, but if we come back, what we will see is it is exactly, the starting point is exactly here. Middleware for a coming request 0101. 02, middleware for a coming request. Before running cookie parser, requested cookies is undefined. Middleware for a coming request. After running cookie parser middleware, now we have requested cookies. Just think about it. Pre-processing and post-processing. Inside the logic of our APIs, we don't have to deal with this thing. We don't have to be worried about if we already have this object called request.cookies. Another one, middleware for a coming request before running body parser middleware. And as you see, request.body is undefined, but middleware for a coming request after running body parser middleware. Now, this request object has been pre-processed, and body attribute has been added to the request object, which is something like this, which has the actual data that we have posted using an XHR request from our browser. Okay, that's it. This is all the steps that I just showed you. This is actually how Express works. If you want to fiddle around more with this express.js middlewares, you could find it in React Workshops GitHub repository. Great. Okay, if you have no more questions about express.js middlewares, what I'm going to do now is to start the discussion about redux-middlewares. Okay. Redux-middlewares.